All right, let's jump right in. Ready for a deep dive on Afghanistan. We're going way beyond the headlines today, unearthing those fascinating insights that you won't find in a quick news segment.
Definitely. It's a country that often gets simplified, right?
Yeah.
Reduced to just conflict and headlines. But there's so much depth to uncover.
Absolutely. We've got a stack of articles and research here, mostly pulled from Wikipedia, and we're going to extract the good stuff, the golden nuggets.
That's what we're here for, to get past the surface and really understand what makes Afghanistan tick.
Think of it like this, Afghanistan 101, but so much more interesting than any class you've ever taken.
I like that. No pop quizzes here, just pure fascination.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Afghanistan, geographically, where are we even talking about? Give us the basics, landscape, population, that kind of thing.
Okay, so picture this. A landlocked nation, smack dab in the heart of Asia, right where Central Asia meets South Asia.
Okay, so already we're talking about a crossroads, geographically. That's going to play a role in its history, right?
Oh, absolutely, we'll get to that. But first, picture this. Towering mountains. I'm talking the Hindu Kush, part of the Himalayas.
Wow, okay, so not exactly a tropical paradise.
Not quite, but it's got its own rugged beauty. You've got plains in the north and southwest too. And then the capital and largest city, Kabul.
Kabul, yeah, a name we hear a lot in the news. How big are we talking, population-wise?
Around 35 million people. That's about the size of Canada.
Wow, okay, so we're talking a sizable country, geographically and population-wise. But one thing I find really interesting is that it's officially called the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan.
Ah, you're picking up on something crucial there. That title alone tells us a lot about its recent history.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? I mean, Islamic Emirate, that's not a term you hear every day. It suggests a very specific kind of political and religious system.
And it reflects the fact that Afghanistan has, well, been deeply shaped by conflict, especially in recent decades. Since the late 1970s, it's been caught in this cycle of coups, invasions, civil wars, making it a focal point of global attention.
It's almost like every time Afghanistan's mentioned, it's in the context of conflict. It makes you wonder, is this a recent phenomenon, or is it, woven into its history?
It's both, actually. To understand Afghanistan today, you got to understand its long history of conflict, how different eras and events have shaped its trajectory.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock way back. How far back are we talking?
We're talking 50,000 years at least. Archaeological evidence suggests humans have been living in this region for as long as folks in Europe were creating those cave paintings.
Whoa, hold on. 50,000 years. That puts things into perspective. So we're not talking about a new kid on the block here. This is a place with ancient roots, long before the current conflicts.
Exactly. I'm talking early farming communities popping up, even urban civilizations way back 3000 BCE.
Okay, so we're talking ancient civilizations, on par with Egypt, Mesopotamia.
You got it. And here's a fascinating tidbit. There's even evidence linking Afghanistan to the Indus Valley civilization.
Wait, the Indus Valley civilization, that's one of the oldest in the world. I had no idea.
It's true. There's a site called Shortugai in northern Afghanistan that provides evidence of this connection. It's incredible to think about. We often associate ancient wonders with places like Egypt, but Afghanistan is a treasure trove of archaeological wonders just waiting to be unearthed.
It's like this hidden history. This is really blowing my mind. Okay, so we've got prehistoric roots, but what about those empires we always hear about in history class? Did they have a hand in shaping Afghanistan too?
Oh, absolutely. Afghanistan's location, being this crossroads, it made it a prime target for empires throughout history.
Like a prize to be won.
Exactly. Each empire leaving its mark on the culture and the landscape. Like in the 7th century, Islam arrived, gradually spreading, but not without pushback. There was resistance to this new faith.
So already we're seeing this theme of resilience, of pushing back against outside forces.
Absolutely. This resistance and then the eventual embrace of Islam set the stage for powerful dynasties like the Saffarids and the Samanids.
Okay, names I'm not super familiar with, gotta be honest.
They were pretty big deals back in the day, but there's one dynasty that really stands out, the Ghaznavids.
Okay, the Ghaznavids. Tell me more. Why were they so impactful?
Well, they rose to power in the 10th century, and their most famous ruler, Mahmud of Ghazni, he was like a Renaissance man, but in Afghanistan.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Renaissance man in Afghanistan, what do you mean?
He's credited with essentially Islamizing a huge part of the region. He turned Ghazni into this major city, but he was also a massive patron of the arts and sciences.
So not just a conqueror, but a cultivator of culture as well.
Exactly. I mean, He supported scholars like the historian al-Biruni and the famous poet Ferdowsi, author of the epic Shahnameh.
Okay, some big names there. So under his rule, Ghazni was having a moment.
Oh, totally golden age, a time of serious intellectual and cultural flourishing. But, as is often the case with empires, their time in the spotlight eventually fades.
Makes sense, no empire lasts forever. So who came after the Ghaznavids?
Well, in the 12th century, the Gurids took over. They were known for their seriously impressive architecture.
Oh, like what?
The Minaret of Jam. You've probably seen pictures. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site now.
Oh yeah, the one that looks like incredibly tall and slender.
That's the one. It stood for centuries, a testament to the architectural genius of the Gurids. But their reign was relatively short-lived.
A beautiful legacy, though. Okay, so we've got these Islamic empires rising and falling. But what about, like, the Mongols? They weren't exactly known for their gentle touch.
Oh, you're not wrong about that. The Mongol invasion under Genghis Khan, that was back in the 13th century, utterly devastating.
Devastating in what way?
Cities like Herat and Balkh, they were thriving centers of culture and commerce, practically wiped off the map.
So not just a change in rulers, but a complete upheaval of society.
Totally. Imagine the impact. Forced many people back into, rural agrarian lifestyles. It was a turning point, a seismic shift in Afghan history.
The effects probably still felt today.
Oh, definitely. And even the mighty Mongols couldn't hold on forever, right?
Right, of course. So who filled the power vacuum after them?
In the 14th century, Timur, also known as Tamerlane, he swept in, established the Timurid Empire. His grandson, Shahrukh, was really instrumental in making the city of Herat a center of learning and culture.
Another golden age. It's amazing how this nation, we associate it so much with conflict, but it's played such a key role in shaping world history.
It's true. Afghanistan's story is so intertwined with global events, it's hard to separate them.
It's making me think about all those connections, how one event ripples out and affects everything else, but I'm sensing another major power shift on the horizon.
You're reading my mind. Early 16th century, Babur arrives on the scene. He's a descendant of both Genghis Khan and Timur. Talk about a pedigree.
Oh, talk about powerful ancestors. What did he do?
He captured Kabul, then went on to conquer the Delhi Sultanate, established the Mughal Empire in India.
Wait, the Mughals, the ones who built the Taj Mahal?
That's right. And their founder, he got his start by taking over Kabul.
No way. So we're talking major empires, conquests, cultural renaissances, all playing out on Afghan soil. It's wild.
But what about the Afghans themselves? Was there a time when they were the ones calling the shots, building their own empire?
There was. The 18th century, get ready for the rise of the Durrani Empire. Arguably the most powerful Afghan empire in history.
Okay, the Durrani Empire. Tell me everything. Who were these guys? What made them so powerful?
It all started with Ahmad Shah Durrani, a brilliant military leader. He unified the Pashtun tribes, established the empire in 1747. He's considered the father of modern Afghanistan.
Wow, the father of modern Afghanistan. That's a big title.
He earned it. Expanded his realm like crazy, even launched 8 invasions of India.
8 invasions of India? That's a lot of back and forth across the Khyber Pass. Were any of those particularly significant?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The Third Battle of Panipat in 1761, that was a decisive victory for Ahmad Shah Durrani against the Maratha Empire of India. Shifted the balance of power in the region, established Afghan dominance. For a while, they were the undisputed heavyweights of South Asia. So for a while, the Afghans were a force to be reckoned with. But I'm guessing even the mighty Durrani Empire couldn't escape the forces of history forever, right?
Right, of course not. By the 19th century, they were facing challenges from Persia in the west and the rising Sikh Empire in the east. And, well, internal conflicts never help either. The empire fragmented into smaller states.
Kind of a familiar pattern here, huh? Rise and fall of empires. But amidst this fragmentation, did any new power emerge within Afghanistan?
The Barakzai dynasty came to prominence in the 19th century. Dost Muhammad Khan, he was a key figure, all about reunifying Afghanistan.
Sounds ambitious.
Oh, he was. And he even had some run-ins with the British Empire, who were, let's just say, pretty keen on expanding their influence in the region.
The British. Always up to something, weren't they? It seems like every corner of the world has a British Empire chapter in its history. Tell me more about this clash. How did the Afghans and the British come head to head?
So the British were busy, expanding their control over India. They saw Afghanistan as this potential buffer zone against Russian influence in Central Asia.
So Afghanistan becomes this, pawn in their imperial game.
Exactly. They called it the Great Game, this high-stakes chess match between these two empires, with Afghanistan caught right in the middle.
I bet that didn't sit well with the Afghans.
You're right. The Afghans, they had this long history of resisting invaders, and they weren't about to become pawns in someone else's game.
So how did they resist?
Well, the British launched 3 wars against them, trying to control the region.
3 wars. That's a lot of fighting. They must have really wanted Afghanistan. What were these wars like?
Let's just say the British learned a few hard lessons about Afghan resilience. The first one, the First Anglo-Afghan War, back in 1839 to 1842, it ended really badly for the British. Their entire army massacred during their retreat from Kabul.
Wow, that's a brutal defeat.
It was. The Second Anglo-Afghan War, 1878 to 1880, that was another bloody affair. The British eventually got some control over Afghanistan's foreign relations, but it came at a heavy cost.
So even the mighty British Empire couldn't completely subdue the Afghans. It says a lot about their determination to stay independent. But what happened after these wars? Did the British eventually give up on their great game in Afghanistan?
Eventually, yeah. By the early 20th century, they had other things to worry about, global challenges. And they finally recognized Afghanistan's independence in 1919.
So after centuries of being caught between empires, Afghanistan was finally free to chart its own course. What happened next? Did they embrace this newfound independence?
The early 20th century, it was a time of both hope and turmoil. King Amanullah Khan, he came to power after that Third Anglo-Afghan War. He was a real visionary, believed in modernization and reform.
So a reformer king trying to shake things up. What kind of changes did he make?
He introduced new laws, expanded education. He even promoted women's rights. Pretty radical for the time.
Yeah, definitely ahead of his time.
He also tried to break the power of those traditional tribal leaders. That didn't make him too popular in some circles.
Yeah, I can imagine that ruffled some feathers. So it sounds like he was pushing for a pretty dramatic transformation of Afghan society. How did people react to these reforms?
He was mixed. Some embraced this idea of progress, modernization, right? But others, they really clung to tradition. There was strong opposition from conservative elements, especially in the rural areas where tribal leaders saw their authority being undermined.
It's that classic clash between, those who embrace change and those who fear it.
Exactly. It plays out over and over again throughout history, doesn't it?
A tale as old as time. So, did Amanullah Khan's reforms succeed? Or did the resistance prove too strong?
Unfortunately, the resistance won out. He was forced to abdicate in 1929 after a bunch of uprisings. Afghanistan entered a period of instability.
It's a reminder that even the best intentions can backfire if they don't have, the support of the people.
It's a tough lesson.
So what happened after Amanullah Khan's exit?
Things settled down a bit when King Zahir Shah took the throne in 1933. He ruled for 40 years, a period of relative stability and gradual progress.
40 years? That's a pretty long reign, especially considering all the turmoil that came before. What was Zahir Shah's leadership style like?
Zahir Shah was definitely more cautious. He understood that modernization was necessary, but he preferred a more gradual approach. Focused on development rather than those sweeping reforms. He was also a skilled diplomat, maintained good relations with both the West and the Soviet Union.
Oh, wow. That was no small feat during the Cold War, so kind of a balancing act, trying to navigate those tensions.
Exactly. And during this time, the country made some real strides: infrastructure development, roads, establishing a national bank, educational opportunities expanded. They even joined the League of Nations in 1934.
Okay, so things are looking up for Afghanistan, but I have a feeling the Cold War eventually cast its shadow over this period of calm. Am I right?
You are. It was kind of inescapable, that influence. In 1973, while Zahir Shah was on a trip abroad, his cousin, Mohammed Daud Khan, he seized power in a coup.
Classic family drama. Can't trust anyone, right? So what was Daud Khan all about?
He tried to play both sides, accepting aid from both the U.S. and the Soviet Union. But he eventually leaned more towards the Soviets.
Oh, so playing a dangerous game there.
He was. And it set the stage for a pivotal event in 1978. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA, a communist party, they launched a coup against Daud Khan, established the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan.
So the Cold War finally caught up with Afghanistan in a big way. And this was the beginning of those conflicts we talked about earlier, right? The ones that have really defined Afghanistan's recent history.
Exactly. The PDPA's coup was like this chain reaction. Plunged Afghanistan into decades of war. They started these radical socialist reforms, but they were deeply unpopular, sparked armed resistance from various mujahideen groups.
So the country's deeply divided. You've got the communist government in Kabul facing off against these rebel groups. What was the Soviet Union's reaction to all of this? Were they just going to sit back and watch their communist allies struggle?
Not a chance. In December 1979, they invaded Afghanistan, fearing the collapse of the PDPA government. A major turning point, not just for Afghanistan, but for the whole Cold War. This marked the beginning of the Soviet-Afghan War.
The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, it's one of those historical events that sends chills down your spine. What was this war like?
Brutal, 9-year conflict. The Soviet army had superior weaponry, but they faced fierce resistance from the Mujahideen, who were supported by the U.S., Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, others.
It's hard to even imagine the human cost of this conflict.
Millions of Afghans displaced. The country flooded with weapons and so much destruction.
So how did it end? Did the Soviets realize they were in over their heads?
They did. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was changing. Under Gorbachev, they were having their own problems, economic issues, want to change at home.
Makes sense. They had their own issues to deal with.
Yeah, they realized that Afghanistan was just unsustainable. And in 1989, they withdrew their forces.
So finally, Afghanistan was free of foreign troops. But I imagine the country wasn't exactly in great shape after nearly a decade of war.
You're right. The Soviet withdrawal left a huge power vacuum, and Afghanistan plunged into this chaotic civil war. Different Mujahideen factions all vying for control.
So from one conflict to another.
Sadly, yeah. The country was in ruins, economy had collapsed. Millions of Afghans were still living as refugees in neighboring countries. It was during this chaos that a new force emerged, one that would come to define Afghanistan for years to come. The Taliban.
The Taliban, a name that, well, evokes a lot of fear and controversy. Before the 1990s, most people had never even heard of them. Where did they come from?
The Taliban, it means students in Pashto. They emerged from these Islamic religious schools called madrasas in Pakistan. Many of these schools were funded by Saudi Arabia. They presented themselves as this force for order and stability, promised to end the chaos and corruption.
So they appealed to that deep desire for peace and security that people felt after years of war.
Exactly. A lot of Afghans, they were just exhausted, and they saw the Taliban as a potential solution. And the Taliban were really effective militarily, well-organized, disciplined, and ruthless. They quickly gained control of large parts of the country.
So in a way, they were a product of the very chaos they claimed to oppose.
That's a good point. It's often how these things work, isn't it?
But once they were in power, what was their vision for Afghanistan? What kind of society did they try to create?
They imposed a very strict interpretation of Islamic law, Sharia law, on Afghan society. Music, television, most forms of entertainment banned. Women were forced to wear the burqa, that full body covering.
I remember those images. So striking.
Their roles in public life were severely restricted. Schools for girls, closed. And punishments for violating their laws, often brutal and public.
It sounds incredibly oppressive. Was there any resistance to this?
Oh, there was, especially from more liberal and secular Afghans. But the Taliban, they were ruthless in suppressing any dissent. And a lot of Afghans just went along with it out of fear.
So fear and weariness played a major role in their consolidation of power. How did the rest of the world react to this new, hardline Islamic state?
The international community was deeply concerned. The human rights abuses, the support for terrorist groups like al-Qaeda.
Yeah, al-Qaeda, that connection would become tragically significant.
And they destroyed Afghanistan's cultural heritage, even destroyed the Buddhas of Bamiyan, these ancient statues.
I remember seeing images of that. It was heartbreaking.
It was a huge loss. But despite all the concern, no country formally recognized the Taliban government.
So Afghanistan was once again isolated on the world stage. And then, of course, this period of Taliban rule came to a dramatic end on September 11th, 2001.
A day that changed everything.
After the 9/11 attacks, which were planned and carried out by al-Qaeda from their bases in Afghanistan, the U.S. launched a military intervention. The Taliban regime was quickly toppled.
A whole new chapter began, right?
Exactly. 2 decades of U.S. and NATO involvement, efforts at nation building, and then ultimately the return of the Taliban in 2021. It's almost like coming full circle.
It's a lot to process, all of this history. We've gone from ancient civilizations to Mongol invasions, empires rising and falling, the Cold War, the Taliban.
My head is spinning, but in a good way. It's amazing how much we've covered.
It really highlights how much there is to learn about Afghanistan.
It makes me realize that there's so much more to this country than the conflict we usually hear about. But I'm ready for a change of scenery, honestly. Let's ditch the battlefields for a bit and talk about the land itself. What's Afghanistan like geographically? Okay, so we've covered centuries of Afghan history, and it's been intense, to say the least. Empires, invasions, you name it. But now I'm kind of ready for a change of scenery. Let's get off the battlefield and talk about the land itself. What's
Yeah.
Afghanistan like geographically? Paint us a picture.
Okay, get ready for some serious natural beauty. Afghanistan is dominated by, the Hindu Kush mountain range.
Ah, the Hindu Kush. We've heard that name come up a few times.
Right. It's this western extension of the Himalayas. Towering peaks, rugged valleys, glaciers feeding rivers that flow in every direction. It's quite something.
So, not exactly a beach vacation destination, but I bet it's stunning in a rugged kind of way.
Yeah.
What about the climate? What's it like living in this mountainous land?
Think extremes. You've got harsh winters up in the high mountains, temperatures way below freezing, and then you've got scorching hot summers in the lower lying areas. Most of the country's arid, which means very little rainfall.
So, you've got deserts too.
Oh yeah, deserts and semi-deserts are definitely part of the landscape.
So, we're talking about a land of stark contrasts, from snow-capped peaks to scorching deserts. It really makes you wonder how people have adapted to such a challenging environment over, thousands of years.
It's a testament to human resilience, isn't it?
Right.
The Afghan people, they've carved out a way of life in this demanding landscape. Their culture, their traditions, their very identity is tied to this land.
It just makes you realize that there's so much more to Afghanistan than, the conflict that we constantly hear about. So let's explore that a bit. Beyond the headlines, beyond the war, what's Afghan culture really like?
Well, one thing that stands out is the importance of family. Family is at the heart of Afghan society, often structured along patriarchal lines, strong tribal ties.
We've talked a bit about those tribal ties and how they've influenced the political landscape. Can you give us some more insight into that?
Sure. Take the Pashtuns, for example. They're the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan. They have this code of honor called Pashtunwali.
Pashtunwali. Yeah, I've heard that term, but I don't really know what it means.
It's basically this set of values emphasizes hospitality, protection of those seeking refuge, and, controversially, revenge.
So it's kind of a mixed bag.
You could say that. That's complex. But it's been a defining element of Pashtun society for centuries.
A real moral code. And those tribal ties, are they still really strong in modern-day Afghanistan?
Oh, very much so. Tribal structures often go beyond, national identity. Loyalty to one's tribe often comes before loyalty to the nation.
Wow, so it's almost like these parallel systems of governance and loyalty?
It's been a factor in a lot of the conflicts that Afghanistan has faced, different tribes vying for power and resources.
Right, that makes sense. It adds another layer of complexity to the situation.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond these structures, what are some other hallmarks of Afghan culture? What do Afghans value? What brings them joy?
The Afghan people, despite all the hardship, they've got this incredibly rich cultural heritage. Poetry, music, storytelling, it's all deeply rooted in their traditions.
I'm always fascinated by how culture manages to thrive even in the most difficult circumstances. So tell me more about those traditions.
They've got this strong sense of community. Gatherings and celebrations are central to their lives. And they're renowned for their hospitality, welcoming even strangers with open arms.
It's a beautiful thing, that kind of hospitality. It speaks to something deep within the culture.
I think so. It's a reminder that even in the midst of conflict, the human spirit finds ways to connect, to find beauty.
Absolutely. And you mentioned poetry and storytelling. I'd love to hear more about that. What are some of the themes that, come up in Afghan literature?
You'll find things of love, loss, honor, and always this appreciation for the beauty of the natural world. Epic poems, like the Shahnameh, that one that tells the history and mythology of Persia.
I've heard of it, but I admit I don't know much about it.
It's still incredibly popular. And there's this unique form of poetry called lande.
Lande, what's that?
They're these short two-line verses, often witty or poignant. They capture the essence of Afghan life.
I love that. Little snapshots of life.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got poetry. What about music? Any instruments or styles we should know about?
The rubab, it's a stringed instrument, kind of like a lute. It's considered the national instrument of Afghanistan.
A rubab.
Its sound it's really melancholic and soulful. Often accompanies traditional songs and stories.
I can just imagine it. The rhubarb playing alongside those landes and epic poems. Afghanistan has been influenced by its neighbors too, right? Has that influenced its music at all?
Absolutely. You'll hear influences from Indian classical music, Persian melodies, even Central Asian rhythms. And in recent decades, modern pop music has become popular, especially among younger people.
So it's a real blend of old and new.
It is. It's really fascinating how those influences come together.
Speaking of blends, no cultural exploration is complete without talking about food. What are some must-try dishes if we ever find ourselves in Kabul or Herat?
Get ready for a culinary adventure. Afghan food is known for its flavorful rice dishes. You gotta try kabuli pulao, rice cooked with meat, raisins, carrots, delicious.
That sounds
And of
amazing.
course, there's a whole array of kebabs, stews, dumplings, and don't forget the naan, freshly baked flatbread. You can't have a meal without it.
It all sounds so good. I'm getting hungry just thinking about it. Okay, so we've covered so much ground, ancient history to modern-day culture and cuisine. But let's bring it back to the present. We know the Taliban are back in power. Where do things stand in Afghanistan today?
It's complicated. Afghanistan is at a crossroads, facing a lot of challenges. The Taliban are trying to gain international recognition, but it's not going so well. The economy is struggling. There are serious concerns about human rights, especially for women and girls.
It's a sobering reminder that the story of Afghanistan isn't over. So for our listeners who are feeling overwhelmed, inspired, and wanting to learn more, what are some key takeaways they should keep in mind about Afghanistan?
First, remember that Afghanistan has this incredibly deep and rich history going back thousands of years. It's been a crossroads of civilizations and empires, and that's shaped its diverse culture and complex social structures.
It's so much more than just a war-torn country, as we so often hear it described.
Exactly. Second takeaway, the Afghan people have shown incredible resilience in the face of, just constant conflict and hardship. Their traditions, their values, their spirit, it all endures.
And that gives us hope, right?
It does. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit is powerful.
And finally,
As Afghanistan navigates this new chapter, it's crucial for the rest of us to understand its history, the forces that have shaped it, and to engage with the Afghan people with empathy and a willingness to learn. Their story is our story, and their future is connected to our own.
beautifully said. I'm really glad we had this conversation. It's been an eye-opening journey. To all our listeners out there, I encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning about Afghanistan, its history, its culture, and its people. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Afghanistan. It's been a privilege to share this time with you, exploring this fascinating and complex nation.
My pleasure.